No, Carbine plus Bushwhacker with max attack speed does absolutely outdamage Flock Pyro. It's not close. Flock Pyro does like 200 or 300 damage a second. You do almost 700. You're disgusting. Heavy, please stop shooting at the tank. You do 75% less damage to it. You were shooting the tank, Chief. You do 75% less damage. You were shooting. I watched you shoot the tank and ignore the things. What do you think? You can't lie to me. I was standing behind you. Stop shooting the tank, please. Yeah, you did. There was a scout on the other side. That's why. Yeah, just in case anyone wasn't there. Never shoot the tank. Heavies deal 70. Heavies, you don't need to shoot these damage. What a recovery. Good job, everybody.
The Heavy is the heart of most man versus machine teams. In the hands of a strong player, he can do incredible damage, especially when well supported by his teammates. At the same time, he's perhaps the most approachable class for inexperienced players. A safe place to stick the newbies while they learn the game mechanics. But whatever the skill level, having a Heavy helps. Bosses are considerably harder to defeat without a Heavy. Early wave giants are harder without a Heavy. The Spy works beyond enemy lines, and the Sniper stays behind friendly lines, but both of these roles presuppose the existence of a line, and that line is usually anchored by the Heavy. It doesn't matter how many robots you kill if you can't hold your ground. And if there's one thing the Heavy's good at, it's holding ground. When it comes to the Heavy's weaponry, the stock minigun sets the bar. At point-blank range, it puts out more damage than any other class can reliably muster, from about 500 to over 800 damage per second, depending on upgrades. If the Heavy can stay alive and keep shooting, the minigun can kill most things. The Brass Beast used to be the meta weapon for the Heavy, but I think it's a lot less popular than it used to be. The damage bonus and the low health defensive buff make it seem like a good weapon on paper, but the decreased movement speed can be a humongous pain. Positioning is a huge part of playing as the Heavy, and the decreased speed makes positioning a lot harder. An inhibited ability to close in on targets and take advantage of damage ramp up can easily negate the damage bonus, and if you need to move somewhere, you may be forced to stop shooting entirely and spin down in situations where a minigun Heavy could have just kept fighting. If you're standing next to a dispenser and holding M1, especially on a map where it's easy to hold a static choke point, then the Brass Beast is great. But it loses effectiveness the more dynamic a situation becomes. I would classify Natasha as a niche weapon. It suffers from a large damage penalty that's hardly mitigated by the low health defensive buff. However, the slow on hit effect is really effective at countering giant scout robots, one of the biggest threats to teams with tunnel vision. So that alone can justify using this weapon on missions with lots of giant scouts if you don't strictly need the full damage output of the stock minigun. The Hua Long Heater is a risky but not necessarily bad choice. It chews through ammo like a motherfucker and it has a small damage penalty, but it sets stuff on fire and the damage bonus against burning targets can boost its DPS above that of the stock minigun, making it an interesting choice if ammo isn't a problem, and especially if you have a pyro on the team. It's unlikely to outdamage the stock against groups of small bots, but the higher damage when you're going toe-to-toe with a boss or other giant that everyone's focusing on can really come in handy. The Tomislav is kind of bad. The main benefit of the weapon, the silence that allows you to surprise human opponents in PvP, does absolutely nothing in MVM. The secondary advantages of faster spin-up and especially decreased bullet spread probably make up for the decreased firing speed when you're fighting at medium to long range, but MVM Heavy involves a lot of going toe-to-toe with giant robots. You'll really miss that extra 20% or so of damage at close range. Still, it's not nearly as bad as you might assume from reading the description. Since the Heavy's minigun is so powerful, his other weapons aren't really that important, but they do have their uses. Before I made this video, I didn't think the stock shotgun had much of a purpose, but it's actually kind of useful for shooting while on the go. In particular, the Heavy's primaries are terrible for chasing after robots that get behind you. Instead of vainly shooting at the back of the bomb carrier as it slinks out of minigun range, you can run to catch up to it while shooting at the same time. The family business and the panic attack can be used similarly, with their different stats being inconsequential in this context. The sandwich and the second banana are another group of weapons that are essentially just slight variations of one another. Both weapons can either be eaten to heal the Heavy, or be thrown as a health pack. In both cases, the sandwich provides more health while the second banana recharges faster. The sandwich is probably better for MVM because recharge rate will rarely matter. I like to throw either of the two on the ground at the beginning of each wave as a health pack for my teammates. The Dolokos bar is a third lunchbox item that functions similarly to the second banana, except that it only heals 100 health if you eat it. However, it also boosts the Heavy's maximum health by 50 points, meaning that you can start every wave with a small health buff if you equip this item and eat it during the administrator's countdown. The Buffalo Steak Sandwich is a fourth lunchbox item, again providing a medium health pack if thrown to a teammate. However, instead of providing health when eaten by the Heavy, it grants mini crits and a speed boost for 16 seconds while restricting you to melee only. This has very limited utility in MVM, especially since the mini crit boost is balanced out by the time it takes you to stop and eat the steak. In other words, even if you're in a situation where pure melee makes sense, it only provides a net damage boost if you don't have anything better to do while you wait for the eating animation to finish. The Heavy's fists do 65 damage per hit, which is dwarfed by the damage of the minigun, so the only time you'll use the fists is if you're out of ammo, you're attacking something with bullet resistance, or you're trying to drop an uber medic. There's nothing wrong with sticking to stock, though. The Holiday Punch is a straight downgrade from the Heavy's fists since its critical hits do no damage and robots can't be stunned by the laughing effect. The Killing Gloves of Boxing's decreased punching speed is of little consequence, and the 5 seconds of automatic crits granted after an opportunistic kill can occasionally come in handy, though a bit of luck is required. It's arguably a straight but minor upgrade to the fists for MVM. The Fists of Steel provide resistance to ranged attacks in exchange for greatly increased vulnerability to melee attacks, and some other minor debuffs that only really matter if your team has a medic. But even then, the Overheal debuff can actually be helpful by helping the medic build uber faster, or it can just be circumvented entirely by exploiting the bug. They can be useful as an emergency escape option, reducing the amount of damage you take as you run away, as long as you're not getting hit by melee attacks, of course. The Warrior Spirit provides both a damage buff and a built-in health on kill effect in exchange for increased damage vulnerability. I'd say the KGB is usually better for fighting robots, but the Warrior Spirit is a niche option for killing tanks. It does a bit more damage against tanks than the stock minigun, and almost as much as the Brassed Beast's theoretical maximum, all without needing to deal with ammo anxiety. It also benefits more from crit canteens and the Kritzkrieg than the Heavy's primaries do. The Gloves of Running Urgently used to be one of the Heavy's most powerful melee weapons, allowing him to run across the map with a speed boost in exchange for increased damage vulnerability. This was extremely useful for situations when there wasn't a teleporter available. But the modern version causes your maximum health to drain, meaning that you could be dangerously low by the time you reach the front. Definitely still usable, but be careful. I'd also suggest trying this weapon for making quick escapes in emergencies. The Eviction Notice grants a smaller speed boost in exchange for a slower health drain and landing smaller, lighter blows. Both weapons will stop draining your health once it reaches 100. In a vacuum, the Heavy is perhaps the class that benefits most from a survivability first, damage later strategy. A minigun with fully upgraded firing speed only does about 67% more damage than a minigun with no upgrades. Oh, don't worry, we'll get to that in a bit. The Heavy's damage output overall is highly dependent on his positioning. Targets that are further away take both less damage per bullet and get hit with fewer bullets overall. A robot that's directly in front of you might take 10 times as much damage per second or more compared to a robot that's further away but still close enough to be considered in range by most players. If resistances and other survivability upgrades can help the Heavy play more aggressively without dying, then that can lead to higher damage output than offensive upgrades. I do mean if, though. The Heavy as a class is slow and fairly dependent on his team for support in order to reach his full potential. Because of that, the optimal upgrade path for every mission depends on team composition as well as wave composition. The Heavy's strategy depends somewhat on the skill level of the team's engineer, assuming there even is one. Also, relatively non-threatening robots or a medic pocketing the Heavy are both factors in favor of getting offensive upgrades rather than survivability upgrades. Offensive upgrades even start to double as defensive upgrades if there's a scout on the team who actually uses their Mad Milk instead of looking for that elusive last 5 credits. But wait, if you've watched my other videos, you might think, but Mr. Underscore, you advocate for the scout to focus on combat rather than support on most missions. Why are you complaining about scouts who don't give support? Well, just because a scout isn't shooting doesn't mean he's actually throwing milk. A scout who's killing robots and drawing aggro can do a great job of keeping the Heavy alive with little to no milk. But a scout who's preoccupied with the money side quest usually doesn't. A milk and mark scout can be good for support, but he needs to actually be milking and marking the robots, and the correct robots at that. But yeah, Mad Milk can be great for the Heavy when it's actually used properly. Anyway, back to the Heavy. I'm not going to make an upgrade priority chart for this video because for the Heavy, you should just be picking what you need when you need it. I've been finding myself gravitating toward a more defensive upgrade path lately, especially on custom missions. Though back when I played more Man Up, I would focus a lot more heavily on firing speed. When in doubt, go for the defensive upgrades because the Heavy is fairly powerful even without upgrades. And the defensive path will always be at least 60% as powerful as the offensive path at minimum. As long as you're making reasonable choices, you'll be fine. If there were one upgrade that I'd pick as a must-have, it's plus 25 health on kill. Maybe people accustomed to playing with a good pocket medic would tell you differently, but I usually get 2 ticks of this before anything else. The only way to directly increase your minigun's damage output is to increase the firing speed. Plus 10% firing speed is a buggy upgrade that doesn't actually increase your firing speed by 10% and doesn't even work the same for every gun. We'll get back to that. For now, just know that maximum firing speed increases your DPS by about 60 or 70%, almost as if the amount of time it takes you to empty your clip has been reduced by 40%. It hasn't, but that's the end result. The other way to increase your damage potential is by purchasing projectile penetration. Each level increases the number of robots that your bullets can go through. The second and third levels aren't usually worth it, but the first level effectively doubles your damage output against tightly clustered groups of robots. If you're counting, that means that 1 tick of projectile penetration can be as good as all 4 ticks of firing speed for a fraction of the cost, depending on the map and the wave spawns, of course. It also has the benefit of not chewing through ammo faster like firing speed does. Speaking of ammo, nothing hurts your damage output more than not shooting. You'll find yourself wanting at least a tick of plus 50% ammo capacity early on for a lot of maps and missions, especially if you don't have a good engineer. Or even if you do, having extra ammo means that you're less tethered to the dispenser, allowing you to play more aggressively and do more damage. Destroy projectiles is a defensive upgrade for the miniguns. It allows you to shoot rockets, grenades, and most other projectiles out of the air to keep them from hitting you and your teammates. It can be tricky to use, but there are situations where it'll be better than blast resistance, which is capped at 75% and only protects you. Situations that are good candidates for destroy projectiles are ones where there are relatively few high damage projectiles in the air. The last minigun upgrade is Knockback Rage. This gives you a rage meter which charges as you deal damage, and when it's full you can activate a rage mode that reduces your damage output but also makes your bullets push robots backward. This upgrade is situationally useful and requires a bit of skill, so it's not that popular. If you try to use it to push giants away from you, it might annoy your teammates, just like Force of Nature, Air Blast, and other mechanics that make the robots move unpredictably. Whatever you do, don't buy more than 1 level of Knockback Rage, since levels 2 and 3 are broken and don't do anything. As with any other class, crit resistance is critical when there are a significant amount of crit robots. Get the other resistances as needed. Health regen and jump height aren't usually of much use to the heavy, but plus 10% movement speed can be surprisingly useful for both mobility and for staying alive. Even the slowest class takes less damage when strafing from side to side, especially when it comes to dodging rockets and other projectiles. Okay, so how does the firing speed upgrade work exactly? Well, the Heavy's primary weapons are exactly the kind of fast shooting weapons that have wonky MVM upgrades because of damage rounding and the game's internal timing system. Due to all of the rounding, plus 10% firing speed doesn't actually mean plus 10% firing speed. If the upgrades worked as expected, the miniguns would all empty their magazines in 90, 80, 70, or 60% of the usual time depending on upgrade level, with a maximum increase in damage per second of 67%. However, the minigun, the Brass Beast, and Natasha all empty their magazines in about 86, 86, 71, and 57% of the usual time, depending on upgrade level. That's right, the second upgrade doesn't even do anything. Also, as far as I can tell, sometimes your gun will randomly take 65% of the usual time to empty its magazine when fully upgraded instead of 57%, and I have never seen an explanation for this discrepancy. But wait, there's more! The Tomislav has a different base firing speed than all of the other guns, so the rounding comes out differently. This time it's roughly 97, 88, 74, and 60%. Except that sometimes the gun seems to just start at 97% and the first upgrade doesn't actually do anything. Finally, there's the Hualong Heater. This is the hardest gun to measure due to the fact that it expends ammo even when it's not shooting. In spite of the internet saying otherwise, my testing indicates that all of the upgrades really do something. with the proportions appearing to be roughly similar to those of the Tomislav. This is interesting because the Hualong heater does not have an altered firing speed like the Tomislav, and it should theoretically behave like the other three guns, like everyone else on the internet seems to assume it does. This makes no sense. I spent 2 days running tests on both local and community servers, and oh my... And that's just firing speed. I kind of suspect that further rounding shenanigans can happen translating bullets to damage. In tests I ran, I got the Heavy to destroy targets that he shouldn't have had enough ammo to destroy, even with maximum damage ramp up. There's some weird stuff going on here. I've heard that SV cheats can mess with the game's math, but most of this happened on local servers with SV cheats off, sometimes never having been activated at all. And some of the inconsistent firing speeds happened on a public Moonlight MVM server that wasn't even under my control. Suffice it to say, damage per second will roughly increase proportional to firing speed and max out at roughly 65 to 75% of the base rate, depending on the gun and your RNG, I guess? Oh yeah, and one more small thing. I don't usually play with canteens, and I don't usually cover them in these videos, but due to the fact that the Heavy has limited potential for increasing his offensive capabilities above their base level, he's an above average candidate for using crit and uber canteens instead of buying upgrades. First, let's take a look at the mechanics of the Heavy. The Heavy is a slow-moving, tanky class that's meant to take the brunt of any attacks against his team while being extremely dangerous to get close to. Like most ranged classes, the Heavy does more damage up close, except that it's even more pronounced. Targets at point-blank range get vaporized by the Heavy's minigun, while targets that are far away only get their health chipped at bit by bit. Miniguns, like many other weapons, do base damage at slightly more than typical dueling range, which the wiki says is 512 hammer units, or about the distance between the crate and the wall on Manhattan. As you approach point-blank range, your bullets do up to 50% more damage due to an increase referred to as ramp-up. They also do as much as 50% less damage at long range due to a mechanic known as fall-off. Well, the wiki says they do 50% less. Based on my own testing, it seems like it's actually slightly worse than that, but only slightly. But wait, there's more. You will also have more bullets miss at longer ranges because they don't actually go exactly where your crosshair is aiming. Instead, they spread out randomly in a sort of cone shape. As alluded to earlier, this makes the Heavy's damage output vary by a factor of 10 or more across normal ranges seen in combat. This is also true of the Scout's scatterguns, but unlike the Scout, the Heavy is slow and fat. Thus, positioning is everything for the Heavy. This means that you usually need to be standing in the robot's path and making them come to you. Make the robots do the work. It's best if you don't have to spin down your minigun and run to a different spot on the map, and you certainly don't want to be slowly crawling behind the robots, shooting them in the back as they push toward the hatch. Almost every MVM server has an engineer, so the dispenser is usually going to be your home base. Assuming your engineer doesn't hate you, he's purchased extra dispenser range, creating a small zone on the map where you can move around and fight without ever needing to stop shooting. In fact, since the Heavy is so dependent on having a dispenser, many engineers will actually ask you where you'd like it to be placed. That's not to say the Heavy is unplayable without a decent engineer supporting him, but he's definitely not going to reach his full potential without one. Your gameplay is going to be a lot messier if you have to constantly stop shooting and spin down to grab ammo. The other class that has a special symbiosis with the Heavy is the Medic. A good medic can allow the Heavy to fight much more aggressively than he would otherwise be able to, doubling or tripling his damage output. The medic is never necessary, and it helps if your friends and have good synergy together, but this pairing can definitely be greater than the sum of its parts. The scout and the soldier can also serve to buff the Heavy. That's kind of the idea behind the two cities' meta team composition, but I don't think there's any special relationship like with the medic or the engineer. Anyway, you, your dispenser, and maybe your medic are going to want to post up at a choke point on the main bomb route and allow the map to funnel robots to you. As with most TF2 game modes, it's better to spend more time fighting than walking. Sometimes you'll want to temporarily push up to boost your damage, or fall back to avoid dying, but the heavy always comes back to his ammo source. Once you get a sense for good positioning, it should become second nature. The main mental task that you perform while playing as the heavy is probably target selection, prioritizing threats based on how close they are, how dangerous they are, how fast they're moving, if they're carrying the bomb, whether any of them provide healing when hit or killed, whether any of them are marked for death, and other factors. In general, you should default to always shooting at the closest robot, since that's usually the one that your gun will be most effective against, and often the one that's the biggest threat to you. One example of an urgent reason to immediately switch to another target would be the appearance of a giant scout or other critical target that can change the flow of battle if not defeated quickly. Another would be a bomb carrier that's buffing. Other factors have a more subtle influence on target selection. If you're running low on health, you might want to flick your crosshair away from a giant robot to take out a few smaller bots for a quick health boost, or vice versa if the giant is milked. If a robot's small or fast-moving, you might want to ignore it and let the Sentry take care of it while you focus on a big, slow-moving giant that soaks up your bullets. If a robot is marked for death, then damage fall-off is negated, though not bullet spread, and you'll do mini-crit damage, so that's always a consideration. Taking all of these factors into account is obviously more of an art than a science, and requires a lot of on-the-fly mental calculation. You may hear people joke about how the heavy is a brain-dead class that doesn't require any thinking. But while it's true that the heavy has a low skill floor, there's really no reason that an expert player shouldn't be fully engaged on a fast-paced mission of appropriate difficulty. Now that we've established a strategic framework, let's look at some tactics that can help the heavy on the battlefield. Did you know that the heavy shoots out of his face? That's right. Even though the heavy's player model has his gun slung low below his belt, you can actually shoot anything that you can see. You can use this trick to peek over obstacles and terrain while protecting yourself from return fire, especially projectiles. Vertical obstacles to peek over aren't as common as corners to peek around, though. If you're in a situation where it's not safe to take bots head-on, you can position yourself at a corner to shape the combat matchup. You can't pop in and out of cover to shoot like some classes, but you can adjust your angle so that only the lead bot from a squad can see you at any given time. This lets you pick off a squad one by one instead of fighting them all at once. You might also be able to shoot larger robots without them seeing you. If you can't see their eyes, you're probably safe. Since the heavy's offensive power is highest at close range, it's good to push forward when safe to do so. Safe can mean the medic has deployed a shield or uber charge, or it can mean a giant soldier or demo is reloading its clip and won't be able to fire again before you destroy it. It might mean that a giant is milked and won't be able to outdamage your healing, or it might mean that the robots that have spawned just aren't very dangerous. One nice opportunity for pushing forward is the synergy between the heavy and the spy. The spy is more strongly prioritized by robot AI than any other class, so when you see a spy going in for a backstab, you know that you're about to automatically get a few seconds where the robots have their backs turned to you, and that's enough time for the heavy to destroy most things. It's also important to note that robots will often target a medic that's healing you instead of targeting you. So frequently the simple fact that you're connected by a heal beam keeps you safe and forces the medic to dodge rockets in your place. According to the legendary I cannot find any information on how to pronounce that out loud, and I can't reach them to ask. Anyway, according to Sig, targeting the medic instead of his patient is behavior associated with hard or expert level AI, which is most giants as well as some smaller bots. Body blocking is an important tactic for stopping very tanky or very fast giant robots, and the Heavy is probably the best class for body blocking. Not only does he have the most base health, but he also doesn't have to worry about injuring himself with explosive damage like the Demo Man and the Soldier. Standing directly in front of robots is a natural position for him. The two disadvantages he has are that he's vulnerable to crit damage and knockback, so a giant crit Force and Nature Scout will be a better job for the Engineer's Sentry. Getting sent flying can be useful though. A common theme throughout this video is that the Heavy is slow. Well, explosion surfing can help with that. If a giant soldier shoots a rocket at your feet, you can hop over the explosion while crouch jumping to get a boost. This can help you escape, help you push forward, or just help you grab some ammo. As a bonus, the Heavy's high health pool makes it relatively easy for him to survive this maneuver. As mentioned during the upgrades section, the Heavy has two special abilities that can be unlocked: Knockback Rage and Destroy Projectiles. As I stated earlier, Knockback Rage can annoy your teammates and potentially stunt your entire team's damage output, so use it judiciously. There are several uses for Knockback Rage: pushing robots into death pits, knocking robots off of the bomb hatch, disconnecting giant medics from their patients, and just sending robots backwards so they can't overrun you. I don't personally use it very much, but maybe that's just because I'm boring. The best targets for Rage are giants, since they have enough health that they can be pushed effectively without dying. Oh, yeah, and you can use it to send bosses flying through the air so that they take fall damage. Destroy Projectiles takes a bit of skill, so make sure you know how to use it before you buy it. To knock projectiles out of the air, you actually need to hit them mid-flight. This requires taking their origin point and flight path into account. Soldiers shoot from the level of their shoulder and usually aim down at your feet, while the Heavy shoots from his head. Aiming slightly below a soldier robot's belt seems to do a good job of maximizing the chances that your bullets intercept rockets on their way down. Crouching might help a bit too if you're willing to sacrifice movement. Demo robots, meanwhile, shoot arcing shots, so you need to aim up around their heads if you want to deflect their grenades before they drop down below your line of fire. Destroy Projectiles can deflect some other kinds of projectiles, but rockets and grenades are the most common and the most important to learn to defend against. When it comes to robots, perhaps the most obvious robot that deserves special consideration is the medic bot. Common quick-fix medics are not a problem for the Heavy, but Uber medics are, so make sure you know the difference. The Heavy's primaries can't kill a medic robot very reliably without popping its charge, so traditionally, the Heavy waits for another class to drop the Uber medics before proceeding to finish off whatever they were pocketing. It's important to note, though, that you can wear the pocket's health down to half before the medic will react, so you can actually do a lot of work on a giant while waiting for the demo or sniper to take out the medics. Even if you don't have a class to fill this role, it can still be good to focus on the giant first, since it's far better to have the giant at half health when the Uber wears off rather than at full health. Also, if you're popping medics instead of dropping them, they should be popped quickly so that their Uber wears off before your team is overwhelmed. And if one medic in a group is popped either on purpose or by accident, then you should just pop the rest of the medics too so that their charges all wear off at the same time. Honestly, this advice applies to classes like the Pyro and the Engineer too, but it's extra important for the Heavy because the Heavy is all about target selection and is also bad at running away when things go wrong. Alternatively, you can try taking out Uber medics with melee. Your results will vary. Giant medics are another matter. Typically, their heal rate is effectively infinite, so you'll never be able to meaningfully damage their patient. Instead, shoot the medic first, preferably at point-blank range to minimize the chance of popping its charge. Or just let another class handle it. Shield medics are only found in custom missions. They can be a pain for classes that attack from the front because they're most vulnerable from the rear, but unlike the sniper or the engineer, the Heavy can often just jump through their shield to get behind their defenses. And after that, they usually don't last too long. The Heavy has a relatively good matchup against Soldier and Demo bots because even without the Destroy Projectiles upgrade, his crawling speed while spun up is often enough to dodge a lot of their projectiles, or at least turn direct hits into glancing blows. Heavy robots are a mirror match, though, and there's not much you can do if they have more firepower than you do. Just stay alive and either chip away at them bit by bit, or let your teammates help you. Due to his low speed and the need to constantly face in the direction of his targets, the Heavy is perhaps the class most vulnerable to spy robots. Stay alert and try to peek behind you if you hear them coming, but sometimes you'll be locked in combat with other robots and will just have to hope for the best. Giant scouts are always a priority target. It's often a good idea to station yourself at a corner in advance so that you're ready to body block them at a moment's notice. It's the same method as using a Sentry to block them, except that you use yourself. I show some examples in the Engie video and in a much older video, links in the description. Giant black box soldiers also deserve special mention. These robots notoriously heal back to full health every time they land a hit. Inexperienced teams will often respond to this by trying to avoid getting hit, which rarely works. The trick to defeating these robots is to destroy them quickly while they're reloading. The Heavy is special because, even without upgrades, he has almost enough DPS to handle this by himself. As the Heavy, you need to take the lead against these robots, and hopefully your teammates will follow and finish them off. Finally, the Heavy is the king of fighting bosses. When it comes to dealing heavy, sustained DPS to a single target for 30 seconds or longer, the Heavy is usually your guy, as long as it's safe to get close. Body blocking can help a lot against bosses, since it increases the amount of time your team has to kill them. Two helpful tricks to know in this case are that 1. Giants will try to climb over an obstacle if they're blocked for more than a few seconds. Since it usually takes more than a few seconds to kill a boss, taking a small step back when they try to climb over you will cause them to consider you as a new obstacle and reset their AI timer, increasing the length of the body block. 2. If you block a giant in an area with a low ceiling, they won't be able to climb over you and you can just block them indefinitely. Now it's time to talk about tanks. As everyone knows, tanks are resistant to miniguns, and the Heavy should never, ever waste time attacking tanks. Except, that's not quite true. Tanks do resist attacks from the Heavy's primary weapons. In fact, the Heavy only does 25% of his usual damage against tanks. 1/4. That doesn't mean that the Heavy's bad at killing tanks, though. The Heavy is fine at killing them. The stock minigun and the brass beast can both do almost as much damage as a pyro with the stock flamethrower, assuming the pyro isn't using the hitbox corner damage boosting technique. See my pyro tutorial video for more information. The reason that the Heavy's nerfed against tanks is that he would be hilariously overpowered against them without the nerf. Stock Heavy does nearly 500 damage per second at point blank range without upgrades. Against normal enemies, robot or human, this is weighted against the risk of getting killed when the enemies fight back. None of the tanks in official Valve missions fight back though, meaning that without the nerf, no other class in the game could ever hope to match the tank killing ability of even a vanilla Heavy with no upgrades. Obviously, that would be a bit overpowered. The more sophisticated version of the Heavy shouldn't shoot tanks argument is based on opportunity cost. Other targets aren't subject to the damage nerf, so it's optimal to ignore the tank and shoot at robots instead. All else being equal, yes, but it's more complicated than that. As we've established, the tank is a nice, safe target, so if you're going to be left to fight and die alone without support while your teammates follow the tank, then the tank is obviously the better choice. It's better to shoot with 25% efficiency than to be dead and not shooting at all. Even if things aren't so dire, you've got to remember that you're not going to be shooting at robots with 100% efficiency either. You've got to consider things like damage fall off, bullet spread, and taking cover to stay alive. If you're sitting back at the dispenser and shooting robots from the range that most zero-tour newbies do, then you're probably already well below 25% efficiency. So yes, tanks are usually not the heavy's first priority, but you need to be actually making sure that you have something more important to worry about before you just ignore them. Also, fun fact, miniguns, like other weapons where damage ramp-up is a factor, do more damage to tanks if you walk alongside them and shoot them from the side instead of from the front. When safe to do so, that's the best way for heavy to shoot tanks, except when using the brass beast, which makes him too slow to keep up. In fact, the stock minigun can overcome a decent chunk of the brass beast's innate 20% damage bonus this way. The heavy has a low skill floor, and the MVM meta kind of has a culture of support the heavy, where other classes exist to serve you, not vice versa. The engineer supplies you, the medic heals and buffs you, the soldier also buffs you, the scout picks up the money you drop everywhere and might also buff you if he feels like it, and the demo takes out the stuff you can't handle before it reaches you. Or the sniper, or the W plus M1 pyro possessed by the ghost of a sentient gasoline can. As long as you're not taking the teleporter behind enemy lines to go chasing sniper bots around the map with a shotgun, you're relatively unlikely to run afoul of your teammates unless the team starts losing waves. If that happens, there are a few things that your teammates may check to see if you're doing right. They might check to make sure you have the right primary weapon, usually meaning Sasha or the Brass Beast, and definitely not the Tomislav. You can probably run Natasha without anyone noticing that it's not actually the stock minigun, but the Hualong heater is visually distinct and might draw the ire of people looking for a scapegoat. There are even Brass Beast diehards that will insist you play MVM like it's 2012 and Two Cities hasn't been released yet. Another thing they might check is if you're helping to body block giant scouts and such, which is fair. In most cases, that's something you should be doing. They might also get angry if they notice you doing things that aren't the heavy's job, like shooting tanks, or shooting medics, or shooting something being healed by a medic, which may or may not be valid criticism. I hope I covered those in sufficient detail earlier to make it clear how to handle those kinds of situations. Using knockback rage when your teammates don't expect you to might also annoy a lot of people, especially if you're pushing a giant away from the demo's sticky trap or making the spy whiff a backstab on a giant medic or something. People also used to complain about heavies who popped uber medics before the team's demo man could drop them, but I think that's become rare since the introduction of the gas passer to Valve missions, as well as other factors that just make it seem like uber medics aren't as big of a deal as they used to be. If I'm forgetting something, it's probably some pet peeve of medic mains. Let me know in the comments. This has been the Man vs. Machine tutorial series, The Heavy, with Mr. Underscore. Sorry that I didn't get this one out on Christmas Day. It was actually a lot more in-depth than I expected. In spite of the Heavy being a relatively straightforward class, there was a lot to cover and research on the minutiae of weapon mechanics, upgrade bugs, and such. Also, it turns out that having a tiny intern doesn't actually help speed up production at all. If you think that watching this video has made you a better heavy weapons guy, consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribe to the channel. If you're a clever little Russian and noticed a mistake or oversight I might have made, put it in a comment below and maybe I'll add it to the video errata. Until next time, stay out of the gulag. Cheers!